Hello and welcome. Today we talk about avoiding plagiarism. We talk about how you would be able to write effectively academic papers and what are the things that we need to remember if we need to avoid plagiarism. So this video would be about plagiarism. Why is it considered to be such a serious offense? How do we cite? How do we attribute? When do we cite? What to cite, what not to cite, also types of plagiarism and the tips on how to avoid plagiarism. So this would be divided into two different parts, video 1 and video 2. So I would cover parts of it in video 1 and parts of it in video 2. Now let's begin with talking about what is plagiarism. So in simple words, plagiarism is the use of somebody else's work and passing it off as your own. Very simply, if you copy somebody else's work in an exam, that's also a kind of plagiarism. You are passing somebody else's work as your own. But as we grow up, when we write academic papers, when we write journal papers, when we publish, copying somebody else's work is again an offense, just like cheating in an exam. So it's supposed to be a fraudulent practice. Now, what exactly does it mean to plagiarize? To steal somebody's work and pass it off as your own is plagiarism, as I said. To use somebody else's work without crediting a source. So if you're writing a paper, if you're writing a research paper, you would very often need to read somebody else's work. But if you're reading it, but you do not give them credit, you do not say that you have read these works, that would mean that you are just simply copying from them and do not acknowledge the fact that you read all those things. So that would become plagiarism. And to present your unoriginal work, say for instance, if you copied from somebody or if you've taken a lot of ideas from somebody else's paper, you do not add anything of your own in your research paper, that would also be called plagiarism within this. So it's not as serious as simply control C copying pasting, but this is also a serious offense. In other words, plagiarism is an act of fraud. Now why? Now the expression of original ideas is considered to be intellectual property. So whatever you express and whatever is an original idea coming from you, be it in the form of an artwork, be it in the form of a song, be it in the form of a story, a novel, or even photographs. If you've taken a photograph, if you've used your creative imagination to click a picture which you think would be brilliant, all of that would be intellectual property. If you're making videos, for instance, on YouTube, that would also be intellectual property. These forms of property, almost all forms of expression, fall under Copyright Protection Act, right? So if somebody is copying from there, that would mean that they are plagiarizing. Okay, so this is considered to be a serious offense within academia, and we can imagine that this would be a serious offense outside academia also. Imagine somebody stealing somebody else's words as a song, right? Songwriting, films, novels, etc. All of these fields would have penalties if you are found guilty of plagiarism or if you're found guilty of copying down somebody else's work. And there have been many examples in the past of novelists, of songwriters who have been found guilty of plagiarism, and as a result they have had to pay serious penalties, which means that no publisher, no university would want to be associated with people who commit such a fraud. And one such unfortunate example has been the example of Kavya Vishwanathan, who had written a book in 2006. It was called How Opal Mehta Got Kissed, Got Wild and Got Alive. This is a kind of a young adult fiction, but it was eventually found that it had many similarities with some other works by other writers, and eventually when similarities were found between her work and 3 other writers, her books were actually pulled off from the bookstores, and her 2-novel deal was also cancelled. So the publisher would not want to associate themselves with an author who commits such a fraud. Similarly, there was another journalist called Johann Hari, who had to return an award that he had won because he had plagiarized some of his work, and also he had also indulged in fabrication. Fabrication is also a kind of plagiarism where you make up stuff which doesn't exist, right? So most of the cases, unless it is unintentional, unless it is intentional, plagiarism can be avoided as long as you are citing your sources. If you want to copy somebody else's work, I mean, that can't be, you can't save yourself from that. But unintentional forms of plagiarism, you can easily safeguard yourself from those charges. So how should we do that? First, let us understand what are the various ways in which are considered to be plagiarism. Now, turning somebody else's work as your own, as we said, is plagiarism. Copying words or ideas, even if you're copying somebody's ideas and citing it as your own without giving them due credit, that is also a form of plagiarism. Failing to put quotation marks when quotation marks are required. So if you are copying down somebody's words as they are, that is also a form of plagiarism. Changing words but copying the sentence structure of a source without giving them credit. So if you are changing the words, if you're changing words here and there, if you're using synonyms but you're carrying more or less the same sentence structure, that would also be within the scope of plagiarism. Copying so many words or ideas from a source that makes up majority of your work without giving them credit, without giving the people credit, or is also a kind of plagiarism. All this information is from plagiarism.com. These websites are open source. You are welcome to look at them and understand whether your work falls within the spectrum of plagiarism. Okay, now even simply if you acknowledge that the parts of your work, parts of your research paper has been borrowed from somebody else's work, would safeguard you from plagiarism. Now these days you have many softwares which you can run your work through in order to ascertain whether your work falls within the spectrum of plagiarism, and there are many softwares. One of the softwares very commonly used is called Turnitin. Okay, now Turnitin tells you that there can be 10 forms of plagiarism. If you're a student, you need not go into all these details, but it would be good to understand how should we write our papers in order to avoid any kind of plagiarism. So one would be a clone. If you're submitting somebody else's work completely as your own, that's plagiarism, right? Next, if it's control C meaning you're copying down parts of your work from a single source, you're not changing anything, again that would be fraudulent. Then you're replacing a few words but you're not changing much of it, again that would be a type of plagiarism. If you're paraphrasing from multiple sources and you're fitting it all together and you're not adding anything of your own, you're not citing properly, again that's a problem. Recycling would mean if you've written a paper yourself, right, and you do not cite that and you just post generously, you publish it again, that would also be plagiarism. So for instance, if you have to submit a paper in your bachelor's, right, after your BA or your BTech, whatever, and you submit the same paper without much changes as your MTech dissertation or as your MTech paper or as your MA paper, that would also be plagiarism. That is self-citation. So that's actually self-plagiarism unless you cite it, right? And you can't legally submit the same paper twice for 2 degrees, right? So most universities would have a certain form where you have to declare that the publication that you're submitting, say for instance a publication that you're submitting for your PhD thesis, is not submitted elsewhere for any other degree. Okay, so you would be flouting rules if you are submitting the same paper for 2 separate degrees. Okay, now all these are intentional forms of plagiarism if you are not citing them. What if you are a little absent-minded and you do not do things as they are supposed to be? So look at the 6th type, hybrid. It combines perfectly cited sources and copied passages without a citation. So whenever you write a paper, whenever you write a research paper, keep in mind that you always have to keep noting down if it's an idea you've got from somebody else. Very often we absorb an idea and we eventually start assuming that it is our idea. So it would be a good practice to keep noting down whatever ideas that you have while you're doing research, and you have many citation tools, you have many note making tools which help you to do that. If you're mixing, look at the 7th type. Mashup means mixing copied materials from multiple sources. You're reading multiple sources, you're copying it all. Again, either you forget citing or you do not do it appropriately. That would also be a problem. Next is a 404 error. This is a kind of fabrication. It may be, mostly it would be intentional, but sometimes it may be unintentional also if you are wittingly giving inaccurate information about your sources. Okay, so you have to be very careful about sources. If a source doesn't exist, if you're not sure, do not put it as a citation. Next is an aggregator. Includes proper citation to sources, but paper contains almost no original work. So if you're not adding anything to the discourse, you're just taking from here, taking from there, reading this, reading that, citing everything, right? So you would feel that you're not doing anything wrong. But if you're not adding anything if you're adding no commentary from yourself, if you're not communicating with any of the authors that you're citing, that would be unoriginal work, and it would mean that you are submitting an unoriginal work as if it's original. So that would also fall within the spectrum of plagiarism. Next is retweeting. Includes proper citation but relies too closely on the text, original wording or source. Now this is very difficult to pinpoint, but if that's a problem for your evaluator, you should strictly avoid copying down, even if you're copying down just the sentence structure. So this basically means that you have to be very, very careful with paraphrasing effectively. If you're paraphrasing somebody else's work, make sure that you're also changing the sentence structure. There are many tips of paraphrasing. I would go into those tips as well in a later video. But when we paraphrase, we always have to remember to change the sentence structure. Even though if you're citing and acknowledging, you have to change the sentence structure. If you're taking down somebody's quote, you have to cite, give an in-text citation. But even if you are paraphrasing, you should paraphrase you have to paraphrase very well. You have to change the sentence structure, and again you have to give a citation. If the same writing style is copied, it would still be a problem. And after you paraphrase, always remember to reference it, right? So these were the types of plagiarism. We have to remember that these are the different types of plagiarism before venturing into writing a full paper. Okay.